My name is Dulce Whitford. I'm 28 years old. For 20 years my parents called me the slow one, just because I have dyslexia. Meanwhile, my younger sister Miranda was praised as the pride of the family, Harvard-educated, promised the inheritance invested in at every turn. I, on the other hand, was turned into the punchline at dinner parties, excluded from every important decision, and even when I worked at the same company, I was paid like an outsider. I had grown used to being treated like a shadow, but on the day Miranda graduated at the Plaza Hotel in front of 350 guests, my father stepped onto the stage and announced that Miranda would inherit everything and become the future CEO. The entire room rose to its feet in applause. No one looked at me. At that exact moment, a silver-haired man standing by the door walked straight toward me. He placed a red wax-sealed envelope into my hands and said, "I'm your aunt's lawyer. She instructed me to give this to you on the exact day your father publicly cast you aside." I opened the envelope and realized that my entire family had been lying about me for years. And they had no idea. My grandmother had seen everything. The Whitfords aren't the flashy, newly rich type. This is old money Manhattan, the kind of family whose last name is engraved on hospital wings, displayed on museum donor walls, and spoken at galas where people seal deals with polished smiles and handshakes. My father, Gerald Whitford, runs Whitford Properties, a commercial real estate empire he wears like a badge of rightful heir. But what few people ever say out loud is this: the one who built it all wasn't him. It was my grandmother Eleanor. In 1965, she started out in a tiny office in Brooklyn. No family name to open doors. No powerful network behind her. Just grit and iron discipline. She moved through every deal like a master builder, laying one brick at a time for decades. By 2024, Whitford Properties was valued at around $92 million. A number large enough to make people bow their heads, large enough to turn every decision inside the Whitford household into politics. And in that kingdom, Gerald saw himself as the king. Miranda was the heir displayed on stage. And me, I was the scratch they tried to hide so the family portrait would stay flawless. But they forgot one thing: every empire has roots. And the woman who planted those roots was not blind. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at 7. For most people, reading is ordinary. For me, the words on a page would float, flip, scatter. Even a simple sentence could turn into a maze. My parents' reaction wasn't "how do we help you?" it was embarrassment. By the time I was 12, Miranda was funded like a blue-chip stock: Juilliard-style violin training, French immersion programs, SAT prep, with a Princeton tutor charging $400 an hour. When I asked for reading support, my mother simply sighed. "Dulce, we've already spent too much on specialists. Some children just aren't academic," she said it gently. But what it meant was, "You're not good enough. Accept it." And naive as I was, I believed her. So, I figured things out on my own. I clung to audiobooks to survive. I studied through diagrams, images, and flowcharts because my brain processes visuals faster than text. Every Sunday, I took the train up to my grandmother Eleanor's apartment on the Upper West Side. She never forced me to read it correctly. She taught me to understand it correctly through life stories, examples, through turning knowledge into something tangible I could see and hold in my mind. Once she placed her hand over mine and said, "You may read more slowly than others, but you see what they don't see. That's not a flaw. It's a different kind of vision." At the time, I didn't understand. But I was about to, and the lesson would cost me dearly. Now comes the public cut, the moment that turned me from enduring it into enough. Christmas 2018. My family hosted dinner the way the Whitfords always did. Mahogany table, crystal chandeliers, catered gourmet food, 20 relatives seated in perfect arrangement. It was all a performance titled, "The Perfect Family." My father, Gerald, stood and raised his glass. His voice carried the weight of a shareholder meeting. "Miranda has been accepted to Harvard Law, full scholarship." The table erupted on cue: applause, cheers, hugs, perfectly timed tears of pride. Miranda lowered her head modestly, the humility clearly rehearsed. Then my father's eyes drifted down to me. He paused for a beat as if he had to remind himself I was even sitting there. "And Dooley," he said, the warmth draining from his voice. "Well." A few relatives chuckled. The uncomfortable kind, but they still laughed because they were used to treating me like background decoration. And the part that hurt the most, Miranda laughed too. Not a word in my defense. not even a glance in my direction. I lowered my head and stared at my plate of lamb, forcing myself to swallow the lump in my throat so I wouldn't break down at the table. Underneath it, a thin, wrinkled hand slipped into mine. My grandmother Eleanor squeezed gently silent, but there was something fierce in her eyes. Not directed at me, directed at her son. She didn't say a word that night. What I didn't know was that in that very moment she had already begun preparing to flip the table. Exactly 3 months after that Christmas dinner, she called me up to her apartment on the Upper West Side. Her voice sounded calm, but it was the calm of someone who had already made a decision. She was sitting in her living room, surrounded by old photographs, her standing at a construction site in 1965, her shaking hands with a mayor, her receiving an award as a businesswoman. I noticed something strange. There were almost no photos of my father positioned as the heir apparent the way he always claimed to be. "Dulce," she said, her eyes sharp as glass. "I built Whitford Properties from nothing. Your father only inherited it. He doesn't understand what it means to create something with sweat." She paused, her voice lowering. "He measures people by degrees. I measure them by how they treat the weak. And you are the only one in this family who still knows how to be kind." Then she reached into a drawer and took out a small mahogany wooden box with brass hinges. She placed it directly into my hands, as if handing me a weapon, but one I wasn't yet allowed to use. "Keep it safe. Don't open it. When you need it, you'll know." I wanted to ask, "What's inside? Why me?" But she cut me off immediately. "Not yet. You're not ready. And neither is Gerald." I brought the box home and hid it in my closet like a secret too heavy to carry. I didn't understand then. My grandmother had planted a time bomb, and she was simply waiting for the day my father would press the button himself. If you've ever been labeled the incapable one by your own family, no matter how hard you tried, comment 1 so I know you're here. After graduating from a state university in 2022, no Ivy League name, no shine, I applied for a job at Whitford Properties. I wasn't asking for privilege. I just wanted a chance to prove I wasn't the slow one they had stamped across my forehead. My father agreed. In the way a king grants mercy, he hired me as an administrative assistant, salary $42,000 a year. That same month, Miranda joined the company as chief legal counsel. Salary $280,000 plus bonuses. One of us walked in on a red carpet. The other was shoved into the copy room like leftover furniture. My job description: photocopying, booking meeting rooms, carrying coffee, processing random paperwork for executives who couldn't even be bothered to remember my name. I wasn't invited to meetings. I wasn't allowed to review contracts. I wasn't permitted to touch anything that qualified as real work. But they forgot something. I'm very good at observing. During those long hours by the photocopier, I listened. Conversations drifting down the hallway. Project names, numbers, partnerships, fragments of strategy. I began mapping everything out in diagrams: who was connected to whom, where the money flowed, where the pressure points and risks were. The very skill I had built to survive dyslexia, structural thinking systems, vision, quietly turned into a kind of radar. And that's when I realized something: I was never stupid. I was just placed in the wrong seat. But before I could step out of that seat, they decided to remove it entirely. April 2024. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The subject line: cold as steel. Position: restructuring. Confidential. The body was colder. My role had been optimized. Termination effective the 1st of July 2024. I read it 3 times. No matter how much the letters swam, the meaning didn't change. They were pushing me out. That night I stayed late to organize files. No one noticed. And because no one noticed, I heard everything. Through the thin cubicle wall separating my desk from my father's corner office, their voices carried clearly. Gerald's voice firm. "We can't have her here when Miranda takes over. It looks bad." My mother Priscilla quieter but sharper. "People will ask why she's not in leadership. Why she's like that." My father responded immediately. "Exactly. So she has to go. Give her a generous severance. Let her find something else. Suited to her abilities." Suited to her abilities. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing me. I stood there, my palm pressed against the wall, frozen. It wasn't about the $42,000 salary. It wasn't about the rent in Queens slowly strangling me. It was the realization. I wasn't underestimated because I was incapable. I was kept small because they needed me small, so the Whitford story would stay flawless. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open. If I stayed silent, I would live my entire life under a verdict they had written for me. But if I fought back, I would have to burn down the thing they called family. That night, I glanced at the calendar. Tomorrow was Miranda's graduation party, and I began to understand. They had prepared an even bigger slap. On the 15th of May 2024, I walked into the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, like an extra who had wandered onto someone else's stage. 350 guests, partners, investors, white shoe lawyers, distant relatives, all glittering in expensive fabrics and polished confidence. I wore a simple black dress. $79. The only thing I could afford on the salary they had squeezed down to the bone. I hadn't even found my seat when my mother intercepted me. Her eyes scanned me from my budget makeup to my scuffed heels. "Couldn't you find something more presentable? This is what I have," I replied. She adjusted her Cartier bracelet, as if straightening the family reputation. "You're at table 27, near the service entrance. And remember, tonight is Miranda's night. Whatever resentment or jealousy you're carrying, swallow it. Don't embarrass this family." Table 27, near the service door. Exactly where they thought I belonged. Table 27 was tucked behind a massive pillar, as if someone had deliberately placed me in a blind spot out of every camera frame. On stage hung a giant portrait of Miranda, in her Harvard gown beneath a banner that read, "Congratulations, Miranda Whitford, Harvard Law Class of 2024. At exactly 8:30 p.m., the music stopped. The lights dimmed. My father stepped onto the stage and raised his glass, his voice carrying like a declaration of power. He praised Miranda's brilliance, her discipline, her destiny. Then he delivered the final line to the entire ballroom. Miranda would inherit everything and become the future CEO of Whitford Properties. The room rose to its feet in applause, and I was erased in the middle of the standing ovation. While the ballroom was still buzzing from my father's speech, I glanced toward the entrance and saw a silver-haired man standing perfectly still. He wasn't eating. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't networking. He was observing. And what sent a chill down my spine was this: he was looking directly at me as if he knew I would be sitting at the hidden table 27. As the applause began to fade, he walked toward me. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Each step measured. He stopped in front of my table. "Miss Whitford," I stood up instinctively. "I am your aunt's attorney." I froze. "My grandmother passed away 3 years ago." "I know," he said calmly. No hesitation. "Your grandmother left this for you with very specific instructions. It is to be delivered on the exact day your father publicly casts you aside." Then he reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax and stamped with a notary's mark. He placed it in my hands as if it carried real weight. "What is this?" I whispered. He looked at me, and for the first time there was a trace of warmth in his eyes. "The real will. The one your father has no idea exists." And in that second, I understood. The night they believed they were sentencing me in front of 350 people was the very night my grandmother's plan detonated. I couldn't breathe inside that ballroom anymore. Clutching the envelope, I slipped through the service doors and into the back hallway near the kitchen. The fluorescent lights were harsh and pale. The laughter and applause from inside the ballroom dimmed, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly tore through the red wax seal before I even realized what I was doing. Inside were 3 pages of dense legal text. Notary seal. Signed the 12th of September, 2019. I read slowly. The letters still swam, still shifted. But this time I forced them to stay still. And then I saw the line. "To my granddaughter Dulce Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Whitford Properties LLC. Along with all voting rights. 51%. Control. Not a consolation prize. Not a sentimental gift. The chair of power." I kept reading, my chest tightening. "This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Gerald's treatment of Dulce. She was excluded. Not due to lack of ability but lack of support. Dulce is not slow. Dulce was abandoned. I bit my lip to stop myself from breaking down. She saw everything. And she named it for what it was, abandonment. But there was more. At the bottom, like the edge of a blade, was a condition I had to call for an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving the will. If I failed to do so, the document would become void and everything would revert to the 2015 will, the one my father currently held. That's when I understood. She didn't give me time to think. She gave me a reason to act. If you've ever been underestimated and you're ready to scream, enough, comment one below. That night I returned to my cramped room in Queens. My 2 roommates were asleep, dead to the world. I sat on my bed under the pale orange glow of the streetlight, filtering through the blinds, staring at the mahogany box that had been sitting quietly in my closet for years. For the first time I understood what my grandmother meant by, "When you need it, you'll know." I lifted the lid. The hinge clicked softly like the final lock snapping open. Inside were 3 items. First, a handwritten letter on her personal stationery. She wrote that she was sorry for not protecting me while she was alive, but that now she would protect me in a different way. She stated plainly that Gerald would eventually do exactly what she feared. That was why the envelope was to be delivered only on the day I was officially cast aside. Second, an old document stamped 1965 original partnership agreement. The founding agreement from when she built Whitford Properties from scratch. It clearly stated that the founder's shares carried permanent voting rights and could not be diluted or transferred without full board approval. In simple terms, my father couldn't quietly maneuver around the structure to seize absolute control the way he thought he could. Third, a USB drive clearly added years later. I plugged it into my laptop. A file appeared. Board meeting minutes. March 2018. And in that instant, I understood. She hadn't just left me assets. She had left me evidence. Proof that Gerald had once attempted to strip his own mother of voting authority in order to consolidate control of the company. In a single night, I shifted positions. From the victim to the one holding the paperwork capable of overturning the entire game. The next morning I called Jonathan Ellis. I didn't ask about emotions. I didn't ask about fairness. I asked the only question that mattered. To activate this will, what do I do first? Ellis didn't sugarcoat it. You must call for an emergency board meeting. But you can't do it alone. Under company procedure, you need at least 3 board members to formally sign the petition. 3 people. Which meant I needed allies in a room full of individuals who had spent years nodding obediently to Gerald. One name surfaced immediately, someone my grandmother had mentioned more than once, Margaret Coleman. Part of the generation that built the empire, not the one that inherited it. I dialed her number. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt mechanical. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was raspy but solid like a hammer striking steel. "Dulce, I've been waiting for this call." I froze. "You..." "No," Margaret gave a dry chuckle. "Your grandmother told me 3 years ago." She said, "The day Gerald publicly discards Dulce, that girl will need 3 signatures. You'll be the first." For the first time since opening that envelope, I realized something critical. My grandmother hadn't just armed me. She had prepared the battlefield. Margaret answered in the clipped tone of someone who wastes no words. "No. You need 2 more signatures. Finding them, that's my job. Gerald isn't as respected as he thinks. Plenty of people are just waiting for someone to stand up first." And just like that, within 24 hours, she made the calls, secured the names, and handled the procedure. I received a short text message as direct as a military order petition filed. Emergency meeting May 18th, 10:00 a.m. Whitford Tower, 42nd floor. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. I was no longer alone. And the 72-hour clock had officially started ticking. On May 17th at exactly 4:00 p.m., Gerald found out about the emergency meeting. I know because 45 minutes later Miranda called me. Her voice was no longer sisterly. It was the voice of an attorney preparing to dismantle someone. "What did you do?" I was sitting in my cubicle pretending to organize files like any other afternoon. "What are you talking about?" I said calmly. Miranda's voice sharpened. "Dad just received notice. Emergency board meeting requested by Margaret Coleman and 2 other members. Margaret hasn't involved herself in anything for 15 years. What did you touch?" I answered truthfully, without offering an explanation. Maybe they have concerns about how the company is being run. There was a pause. Then she lowered her voice. Don't play games, Dulce. You don't have the authority to trigger something like this. For the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I guess we'll find out on the 18th. Miranda let out a sharp laugh like glass shattering. Don't play innocent, Dulce. If you're trying to pull some dramatic stunt to embarrass the family, I'm simply following proper procedure, I cut in. Just like you always do. There was a brief silence on the line. Then she delivered her final shot, her voice cold and precise. You're destroying yourself. And she hung up. Less than 20 minutes later, Gerald stormed past my cubicle like a hurricane. He didn't look at me, didn't say my name. He just slammed his office door so hard the walls trembled. Through the thin partition, I heard him growl into his phone. This is ridiculous. Margaret must be losing her mind. We'll shut this down quickly. Dulce. For God's sake, she can barely read a spreadsheet. She's not a threat to anyone. If I had heard that a few days earlier, it would have pierced straight through my chest. But the Dulce, sitting there now, smiled. For the first time in my life, I understood something clearly. Being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's an invisibility cloak. When your opponents rate you as 0, your move hits like an explosion. The 18th of May, 2024, 9:45 a.m. I stood in front of Whitford Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel, the name Whitford mounted high above like a declaration. This is their territory, not yours. I was wearing a blazer borrowed from my roommate, 2 sizes too big. In my hand was a $12 leather portfolio I'd found at Goodwill. Not impressive, but enough to walk straight in. The elevator opened onto the 42nd floor, Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, air conditioning so cold it felt clinical, the kind of cold designed to make people instinctively shrink. I was about to enter the boardroom when a security guard stepped in front of me. Named Dulce Whitford. He glanced at his tablet, frowned. Ma'am, you're not on the authorized attendee list. This is a restricted meeting. I have matters to present to the board, I said evenly. He shook his head. I can't allow that. Then a voice rang out behind me, sweet but edged like a blade. Is there a problem, Miranda? Navy power suit. Hermes scarf? Expression like she had just walked out of a courtroom victory. She looked at me the way one looks at someone who wandered into the wrong building. The guard straightened slightly. Ma'am, she's not on the put. It's fine, Miranda interrupted, eyes never leaving mine. She works here. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. This is not your stage, Dulce. Go back downstairs. For years that tone would have sent me retreating. But I didn't move. I'm exactly where I need to be, I replied. And for the first time, I saw it just for a flicker of a second. Uncertainty. What are you doing here? Miranda asked, her lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. I have information to present. She let out a soft laugh, loud enough for others nearby to hear. You work in the copy room. What exactly are you planning to present? Before I could respond, she went straight for the old wound like it was family tradition. You can't even read basic financial reports. Don't embarrass yourself. And right on cue, like a scene scripted for maximum drama, Gerald appeared at the end of the hallway. He was walking fast, his face flushed with anger. I knew. The real battle was starting now. Gerald approached 2 senior executives, trailing behind him like silent bodyguards. He glanced at me not with a father's concern but with the irritation of a CEO confronting a disruptive employee. What's going on? He demanded. Miranda answered smoothly as if addressing a courtroom. Dulce wants to enter the board meeting. I was explaining that she can't. Gerald turned to me, his voice flat and cold. Dulce, go back to your desk. This doesn't concern you. For 20 years that tone would have ended the conversation, but today I didn't move. It concerns me more than anyone in that room, I said quietly. He narrowed his eyes. And why would that be? I felt my heart beat steady instead of race. Because I hold 51% of this company's voting shares. The hallway went silent. I kept my back straight. I have something to present. Miranda smirked. Present what? How to photocopy documents? Gerald exhaled sharply, then shifted into his familiar tone of manufactured patience. You don't understand what's discussed in there. You handle administrative tasks. Don't waste everyone's time. And then Miranda delivered the family's favorite blade. You have dyslexia. You can't even get through legal documents properly. Don't turn yourself into a joke. The security guard heard it all. A few employees walking past slowed down just enough to watch. I felt it, that familiar pull dragging me back into the role they loved. Assigning me the slow one, the weak one, the embarrassment. They didn't need to attack me physically. They just needed to humiliate me enough that I would remove myself. But this time, I didn't step back. Gerald started to walk past me as if I were invisible. And then a woman's voice, low and steady, cut through the hallway from inside the boardroom. Actually, it does concern her. The door opened. Margaret Coleman stood there, silver hair, small frame presence, powerful enough to silence the entire floor. She looked directly at Gerald. I invited her. Let her in. For the first time that morning, Gerald didn't have an immediate response. Because this wasn't his employee speaking. This was a founding board member. And she had just made it clear I belonged in that room. And in that instant I saw Gerald's face harden. Because he understood something crucial. Today he was no longer controlling the narrative. If you've ever had your own family weaponize shame to silence, you comment 1. I want to know you're still standing. I walked into the boardroom. 12 people sat around a long walnut table, their expressions carrying the same silent question. Let's see how long this girl lasts. Gerald sat at the head. Miranda, beside him, positioned like a crown prince ready to inherit. Margaret Coleman stood. Sother rester, sother way to whole. This emergency meeting has been called due to the emergence of a document that may alter the company's ownership structure. Then she turned to me. I stood up. No apologies. No explanations about dyslexia. Just clarity. What I'm presenting today is not an opinion, I said. It's evidence. I placed the document on the table. This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Whitford, notarized the 12th of September 2019. Gerald shot to his feet as if jolted by electricity. That's impossible. My mother's will is from 2015. I met his eyes calmly. Correct. That's the one you know about. Silence spread across the room like ink in water. Margaret spoke evenly. This document has been verified by Morrison and Blake. It supersedes the 2015 will. Miranda leaned forward, voice razor sharp. On what grounds? I slid another page forward. On the grounds that Eleanor Whitford retained 51% of founding shares with permanent voting rights under the 1965 original partnership agreement. Several board members exchanged looks. Gerald's jaw tightened. That agreement was restructured. No, I replied steadily. It wasn't. I placed the 1965 agreement on the table next to the will. Clause 4.2. Founder shares cannot be diluted or transferred without full board approval. Margaret added quietly. The air in the room shifted. For the first time in his career, Gerald wasn't the one holding the documents. I was. I held his gaze. The 2015 will was revoked by the 2019 will. New York estate law is very clear: a valid later will supersedes all prior versions. I turned slightly toward Jonathan Ellis. He stood and calmly confirmed his capacity as Eleanor's attorney. He verified the signature, the witnesses, the notarization, and that the original document had been held in escrow. The room began to murmur. Miranda leaned forward, voice tight. This is fabrication. She's being manipulated by someone. I didn't argue. I delivered the second strike. I unlocked my phone and pressed play. Gerald's voice filled the boardroom, recorded from the March 2018 meeting. Eleanor is 81 years old. She doesn't understand modern business. I propose reducing her voting rights from 51% to 10%. Silence. Absolute. I ended the recording. My grandmother was not incompetent, I said evenly. She simply recognized who was attempting to strip her authority. And that is precisely why she executed this will. I pointed to the decisive clause: Dulce Ann Whitford inherits 51% of shares with full voting rights. That was the moment it registered on Gerald's face. The slow daughter he had dismissed now held controlling power over the company. Once legal counsel confirmed the will was valid, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The same people who had looked at me like a copy room assistant were now looking at me like what I legally was: the majority shareholder. Robert Hartley cleared his throat and turned toward me, professional and precise. Miss Whitford, as the majority shareholder, do you have a motion you'd like to put forward? I stood. My heart was pounding hard enough to shake my ribs, but my voice came out steady, almost cold. I do. Gerald shot up from his chair, ready to interrupt, but Hartley raised a hand sharply. Sit down, Gerald. She has the floor. Around the table, tension coiled tight. They were expecting what Gerald feared most, that I would remove him on the spot. Miranda straightened already, preparing a legal counterattack. But I didn't do that. I am not proposing the immediate termination of Gerald Whitford, I said. The room stalled. Confused glances. A few brows furrowed. Instead, I continued, I am proposing a vote of confidence. Now they were listening. The board will vote on whether Gerald Whitford retains the confidence required to continue serving as CEO. If the majority votes no confidence, he must resign under the company bylaws. If the majority votes confidence, I will not interfere with operational leadership during my tenure. Silence again, but this time it was a different kind. Not shock. Calculation. Because I had just done something far more dangerous than firing him outright. I had forced the room to choose. I looked straight at Gerald. If you are truly a strong leader, you have nothing to fear. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't revenge. It was surgical. I used the very thing the Whitfords always claimed to value above all else: process, rules, governance. And because it was fair, it was terrifying. Robert Hartley scanned the table. Is there a second to the motion? Not even a second of hesitation. Margaret Coleman spoke. Seconded. Hartley nodded once, his tone shifting into disciplined neutrality. Very well. We will proceed to vote. All those in favor of retaining Gerald Whitford as CEO, raise your hand. 4 hands went up. Every single one belonged to someone whose position had been built under Gerald's protection, men who owed him their seats, their influence, their compensation. They didn't look at me. They looked at him. Hartley paused, then continued. All those opposed. There was a breath heavy suspended. Then one hand lifted. Then another. Then another. Margaret's. And finally, a fourth. 8 seconds of silence, stretched like wire. Hartley counted carefully. 4 opposed. All eyes turned toward the final undecided board member. Because suddenly, this wasn't a formality. It was a reckoning. Hartley lowered his hand and continued evenly. All those who do not have confidence. No hesitation. 1 remaining member stayed still. Abstain, he said quietly. The air in the room grew so heavy I could hear the faint scratch of a pen against paper. Hartley counted again, carefully, methodically. Then he set his pen down. Motion passes. 7-4, with 1 abstention. Under Bylaws Section 14.3, the board has issued a vote of no confidence. Gerald Whitford has 30 days to submit his resignation. No applause. No dramatic gasp. Just the sound of power shifting. Gerald rose slowly. His face was no longer flushed with anger. It had drained to a dull gray, like something vital had been pulled out of him. He looked up at the portrait of his mother hanging on the wall. Then he looked at me. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even threat. It was something heavier. Recognition. Recognition that the person he had treated as zero his entire life had just taken control of the equation. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked out of the boardroom, silent like a king who had just been dethroned in front of his own court. When the boardroom emptied, I barely made it into the private hallway before Gerald stepped in front of me. My mother was there too. Someone must have called her up during the break. Her mascara was smeared, not like she'd cried for minutes, but like she'd been holding something in for years. Gerald's voice came out, low, strained so tightly the veins in his neck stood out. You ungrateful child. You orchestrated this to humiliate the family in front of the board. I met his eyes without flinching. I didn't humiliate anyone. I told the truth. He let out a bitter laugh. The truth, my mother was manipulated. That lawyer, I cut him off. She wrote that will 5 months after you tried to strip her voting rights. She wasn't manipulated. She was defending herself. My mother stepped forward, her voice noticeably weaker. Dulce. You always struggled. We didn't want to put pressure on you. I turned to her. Each word landed like a hammer. No. You didn't protect me. You erased me. You let him call me useless in front of relatives, in front of strangers, and you never once stood up for me. Gerald suddenly grabbed my wrist. This isn't over. I'll contest that will I didn't pull away immediately. Instead, I looked down at his hand, gripping mine, then back at him. You can try, I said evenly. But the notarization is clean. The witnesses are alive. The original is in escrow. And the audio recording of you attempting to reduce her authority establishes motive. His grip loosened slightly. For 20 years, I continued, you told me I was slow. I stepped back, freeing my hand. You just lost your company to the daughter you said couldn't read a spreadsheet. For the first time in my life, Gerald had nothing to say. I pulled my hand free, my voice steady, almost cold. You'll lose, Dad. Grandma prepared everything. I turned and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, my mother called out, Dulce, wait, but for the first time in my life, I didn't wait. The elevator doors slid shut, slicing her voice in half, just like they sliced through 28 years of me trying to be good enough, quiet enough, accomplished enough to finally be seen. I leaned against the cold steel wall and took a long breath. It wasn't joy. It was grief. Because something had just been buried. The hope that if I behaved well enough, achieved enough, stayed silent enough, they would eventually love me properly. That hope died in that hallway. And strangely, I felt lighter. On the 19th of May, 2024, at 4:00 p.m., Gerald signed his resignation letter. I wasn't there to watch him fall. I found out through an email from Robert Hartley. Times Gerald Whitford would step down as CEO. Effective the 15th of June, 2024. Asterisk Hartley would serve as interim CEO during the transition. Asterisk. The board formally offered me a position, strategic advisor to the board in my capacity as majority shareholder. I stared at the email for a long time. 20 years of being dismissed as slow. 2 days of using documents instead of tears. And the seat at the table had changed. Not because I begged for it. Because I claimed it. I read the email several times, a habit from years of reading slowly. But this time it wasn't because I was afraid of misunderstanding. It was because I was trying to adjust to a new reality. I was no longer the one being dismissed. I was the one with decision-making power. That same afternoon, a company-wide email went out. Times Gerald Whitford will step down as CEO. Asterisk. The board welcomes Dulce Whitford as strategic advisor. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. People who used to call me the girl from the copy room suddenly wanted to grab coffee and connect. I ignored most of them. But one message I kept. It was from Patricia Morales, the executive assistant who had been with the company since 1987. Eleanor used to talk about you all the time. She said you see what others don't. Today I finally understand. Welcome to the boardroom. She would be proud. Some recognition doesn't come from family. And sometimes, that's better. Before the aftershocks even settled, my family began circling back. Not because they had suddenly grown kinder, but because power had shifted. On the 8th of June 2024, at 2:00 p.m., my mother called. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, like someone realizing for the first time that something she once took for granted could actually disappear. Dulce, can we meet just the two of us? I agreed. We met at a cafe in Midtown, neutral ground. No Whitford authority. No family territory. She was already there when I arrived. Hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She looked tired. Not dramatic. Just worn. Then she said the sentence I had waited 28 years to hear. I'm sorry. Sorry for staying silent when Gerald humiliated me. Sorry for pushing me to the margins. Sorry for hiding abandonment behind the word protection. I didn't soften immediately. I asked her directly, are you apologizing because you regret it, or because things have changed? She paused. Then answered honestly, both. It hurt, but at least it was real. I set my boundary clearly. I can't pretend the last 20 years didn't happen, but I can try to build something new if it's built on truth. Then in August 2024, Miranda called. No arrogance in her voice this time. She told me she had started therapy. She admitted that being the golden child was also a cage, and that she had been selfish because she was afraid that defending me would pull her down. For the first time, she didn't justify. She didn't argue. She just said, I'm sorry. I laughed. That one sentence mattered more than the Harvard degree ever did. I didn't forgive instantly. But I listened. Because boundaries aren't about revenge. They're about clarity. And clarity changes everything. I ended that conversation with one sentence: I'm not going back to the past. If you want to, we start again from zero. There was no miracle. No instant happy family ending. Just one undeniable shift. This time I set the rules. In November 2024, I moved to Brooklyn Heights, a one-bedroom apartment in a pre-war building overlooking the bridge my grandmother used to cross on her way to her first tiny office in 1965. For the first time in my life, I lived alone. Not as someone surviving in the corner of someone else's story, but as the owner of my own. I formally stepped into my role at Whitford Properties with a new compensation structure. But more importantly, I proposed a direction aligned with my values: sustainable development, green building, responsible operations, long-term impact over short-term ego. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to continue the spirit my grandmother built the company on: creating something useful. I hung her portrait in my living room. Sometimes I catch myself looking at it and it feels like she's reminding me dyslexia didn't make me lesser. It forced me to understand the world through structure and systems. The very thing that got me labeled slow is the thing that allowed me to see clearly when others were blinded by prestige and power. My father measured value in degrees and dominance. My grandmother measured value in character and how you treat the vulnerable. And now I measure my worth by my own standards, not theirs. Never again. If you're watching this, and you see yourself in this story, the one who was overlooked, underestimated, told to stay quiet to keep the peace, remember this. You only need to give yourself permission to stop seeking validation from people who were never going to give it. Comment 1 if you've reached the point where you're ready to say, enough. See you in the next story.